So I'm really delighted to be invited to Rome and to be talking about the topics of the Laudato Si, which I think are so timely and resonant with all that the IMCL is doing. And thank you, Suzanne, for all of your work for Livable Cities. Just give her a hand if you would, please. Fantastic stuff. So this is really an important time for cities and for urbanization, important time in the planet, really. And I think we need to recognize what's going on right now. Urbanization is faster at this current pace, at the current pace of urbanization. We will build more urban fabric in the next 50 years than we have built in all of humanity. And that is a staggering fact and a disturbing fact if you think about what we're actually building, as many other people have talked about. So it's urgent that we recognize the challenges, that we recognize the discussions that are going on, like Habitat 3, which is the 20-year conference that UN has on cities, and that we not just talk about it, but that we actually think about the implementation and the tools and how we're going to actually make the changes that we need to make. And that's what I want to talk about. As some of you know, there are several historic initiatives going on right now. There is, of course, the Climate Change Accord that came out of Paris last December. There are the Sustainable Development Goals that were adopted by the General Assembly in October. And then coming up this October is the Habitat 3 conference, as I mentioned, that will define what they call a new urban agenda. I think we all have an opportunity to influence that. I've been able to be part of that, as I'll describe a little bit more. But I think what we need to do there is to essentially three things. We need to change the models. All of us on a global level need to change the defective models that we've been using for urbanization. We need to change the tools that those models come equipped with, and then we need to change the rules, the legal systems, the protocols, and so on. And that's what I'm going to talk about in a little more detail. All of this goes back to our wonderful mentor and great urbanist Jane Jacobs, great economist of cities and of the kind of transition that we all need to make, the kind of problem a city is, as she described it. And so what we're doing in the group that I'm involved with is focusing on public space systems, because that really is the spine or the connective matrix of cities, and a common focus that we can cut through the silos and think in common about our challenges. And that provides a holistic approach, which is what we need, looking at the connectivity of public space and the process of creating it, as Stefano talked about, and how that framework is provided, what kind of affordance it provides for human beings to live in the city and to prosper. Are they able to walk? Are they able to have social interaction, multimodal accessibility? Sorry, that's cut off there. Fine-grained, uninterrupted network of blocks and streets and so on. And this is from the Laudato Si. This is fantastic. I urge you all to take some time to read this. For new models of progress to arise, we've got to change the models of global development. We've got to think differently about what progress really is. And not just greenwashing, distracting attention, offering excuses, and dressing these bad practices in the language of social environmental responsibility, as the Pope said, and thinking about how to improve quality of human life using an evidence-based approach, as Stefano also said, adapting to the environment and making sure that it's not disorderly, chaotic, saturated with noise and ugliness, which is profoundly destructive not only of human well-being but of our ecological future. And not only is there a patrimony of nature at threat, there's a historic, artistic, and cultural patrimony that we have to think deeply about protecting, and not simply tearing down and building new cities that are supposedly more respectful. We need to incorporate the history, culture, and architecture of each place. Very wise words indeed. As I said, urbanization is going on at a profound pace, an unprecedented pace, and there's some good news in that, in the opportunities for vulnerable populations, better health, opportunities for women, and so on. But there's considerable bad news in that, in that what is being built is functionally segregated and resource inefficient, and from that flow all the other problems, damaging to health, and so on. We, in the developed economies, need to recognize why this urbanization is so appealing. There is an urgent need to overcome poverty and its ills and to provide real opportunities for people. But at the same time, we have a responsibility to find a viable alternative to the model that's going on now, which I will call the crack cocaine of economic development. It gives us a great short high followed by a profound planetary hangover. So we desperately need to provide a viable alternative to that system. And we need to recognize the nature of that system, the origin of that system, and how we can challenge it and replace it. That system, as you know, comes from segregated urban elements, the capsule of your house and the capsule of your car leading to the capsule of your workplace. All of this very rationally engineered, a kind of static system that for passive consumers. And this is the model that was very clearly articulated earlier in the last century. This is from Adolf Bayer, Order and Disorder. On the right, the huddled, dark, unsanitary conditions of the traditional city, and on the left, the wonderful, clean, rationally segregated city of the automobile. Well, we all know how that actually worked out, but this was a consciously chosen model. This is not a random process that got us to where we are, or some kind of consumer preference, and we need to understand that. And we need to understand the connective structure of that model, this tree-like structure on the left-hand side there, as opposed to a more interconnected network model on the right. And Stefano mentioned Christopher Alexander, another great urbanist and thinker about these issues, who wrote a paper called "A City is Not a Tree," where he made exactly this point, helping us to understand these interconnections and how important they are in cities. And again, beginning to articulate an alternative model to the Le Corbusier model. Here's 1922, his drawing, and here's Anywhere USA Today. And here's Anywhere Asia Today. This is actually Jakarta. I was just there 2 weeks ago and took this photo. And they are rapidly urbanizing, building these places that are horrible pollution, horrible deaths from injuries, horrible consequences of rapid industrialization of the built environment, especially around the automobile, but around this model of functional segregation. I think we in the professions especially, but all of us as global citizens, need to recognize our own cognitive delusions, our own inability to think properly sometimes when we get into silos or when we get into sort of professional groupthink. We need to understand how we can get caught up in greenwashing, as my colleague Nikos Salingaros and I wrote about. This, by the way, is a tower that was built or was not built, thankfully, but was proposed in Dubai, and this thing faces into the western sun, blazing away, as you can imagine, and it's got a giant propeller on it to symbolize sustainability. The propeller was fake. But it's only one extreme example of lots and lots of greenwashing that's going on today that is not getting us any closer to our solutions. And it's not all intentional. A lot of it is unintentional. The unintentional consequence of what seem to be rational elements added together and producing absurdity. And Dick Jackson gave me these slides. You saw one of them the other day, but I think they're hilarious and they're very much on point. If you live in a car-dependent community and you need to walk the dog, what do? Maybe you drive the dog, huh? And if you live in a car-dependent community and the only place to exercise is the shopping mall, perhaps you take the escalator to the Stairmaster. That is that shot again, which is a classic. And the point is that these are apparently rational things in isolation, but they add up to irrational and unintended consequences. And that, in a nutshell, is the world that we've been building for the last half century or so. And you've heard already all of the consequences for health, for resource depletion, for all the other problems that we're recognizing. And now we're recognizing the economic impacts of these processes. The 2008 global financial crisis started in the American suburbs, the drive till you qualify suburb. This is a map on the upper left of the mortgage defaults. And you see in the traditional city, very low defaults, where the real numbers of massive defaults occurred are out in these drive till you qualify suburbs. And I can show you map after map. This is Denver, that other one was Houston, but I can show you city after city with the same pattern. This is the economic failure of this drive till you qualify model that collapsed in 2008, along with a number of other similar sort of Ponzi scheme economic ideas. But it's all part of this depletion economics, as I call it, the idea that we are simply need to yank resources out of the ground and burn them up as fast as possible to get economic growth. And instead, we need what I call a repletion economics, something that's much more regenerative. And I'll give you just a quick explanation of that. This is my grandson, Luther, with a tomato grown by his mom in the backyard, as it happens. But it could be that that tomato came from, Baja California and sat in a refrigerated truck, was grown by pesticides, and had, massive injections of fossil fuels and so on. Or it could be that it was simply grown in a CSA in the neighborhood right around the corner, using mulch and without fertilizers and so on. That's the same tomato, essentially. So we can create what I call a repletion economics, and I think we must create a repletion economics. That's the direction that we have to go in. But unfortunately, we are creating a depletion economics based around our urbanization. This is South America, China, India, and Europe, Eastern Europe, Romania. This is the kind of urbanism that we're still creating today around the world. And not to pick on McDonald's too much, but just to think of them as a kind of indicator species, if you will, of this kind of drive-through, lots of disposable packaging, meat eating, and so on. This happens to be one near the Johnson Space Center in Houston. And so I did a little experiment. I went on Flickr, and I looked around in all these places that I just showed you to see if I could find a new McDonald's that's been built in the last 5 years or so. And I'm sorry to tell you that I was so easily able to find new McDonald's in Brazil, in China, in India, in Romania, all of those same places. And bear in mind, this is not just the McDonald's, it's all of the urbanism around the McDonald's that's car dependent, not walkable, high consumption, high disposable, lifestyle, and so on. So this is what we're doing. This is the kind of urbanization that's still going on today, with profound impacts for not only resource depletion, but greenhouse gas emissions. And this is the area of some of my own research that I'll just briefly touch on in this context. When you look at the charts, this is phenomenal. And then this is, by the way, the red shows the city greenhouse gas emissions per capita, and the gray shows the sort of average for the nation that includes the suburbs and the other cities that are less efficient. And so you see the difference between, say, New York City and the USA as a whole. That's like a 3 times greater, almost 4 times, greater number. And then you look at Stockholm and Sweden, and that's like a 6-fold difference. And when you start to tease out the factors, you certainly can't say that, Sweden is poorer than the United States, or Stockholm is poorer. It's wealthier, and all the other factors. What you're left with is urban form and the patterns of movement and consumption and behavior, and how that form affects or limits behavior and consumption. And that's what my research was really interested in, and what urgent actions we need to take as a response. So again, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but just to say that I looked at the existing findings, I developed some strategies coming out of that, and then some design technologies, some approaches that we can use, and I'll just mention those. First of all, urban density, as I think everybody recognizes, is a big factor. And that's logical when you think about the destinations being closer together. It's more efficient to move around between them. And lo and behold, if you look at emissions in, like, say, the Bay Area here, you will find a corollary between density and lower emissions. On the left is emissions from household transportation, and the dark green areas are the low emissions areas, and the red areas are the high emissions areas. On the right is a density map, and the red area is high density, and once again you see a very striking high density, low emissions, low density, high emissions, and you see that over and over again in the data when you look at it. But it's not just the density, it's also other factors of urban morphology that affect emissions that we need to really unpack. And in the case of the low emissions area that I just showed you, it's pretty obvious that there's lots of transit, lots of ability to walk around, compact housing types, and so on and so forth. And that's the other major finding. If you look at the East Bay, you'll see, by contrast, a very sprawling, fragmented, car-dependent, not able to be supported by transit really, bigger houses that people tend to sort of hole up in and stuff with consumer goods and so on and so forth. And this gets into the area of behavior and choice, and the fact that as behavioral economists now recognize, there are influences on our choice. Our choice can be limited by the design ahead of time. If we go into the store and we choose the 27 boxes of cornflakes, that's a choice that's already been structured for us. All of those, if there's a 28th box and it's back in the storeroom, we're not going to choose it because it's not there. It's not part of the choice architecture. So neighborhoods also have a kind of choice architecture that I think we need to recognize, and this is, I think, an important area of research that we should follow through on. So summarizing the research, there are lots of big factors like transportation, but then there's lots of little factors like the infrastructure and ecosystem services and other things that all add up to some really big numbers. If you're looking at the aggregate numbers globally speaking, you're talking about somewhere in the range of 1/3 of all greenhouse gas emissions, and sometimes more depending on what you're talking about, sometimes a lot more. So this is a very big deal that we're talking about when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions and all the other impacts that we've been talking about, human health, resource depletion, and so on. So for strategies, we need to shift the patterns of urban form, particularly the new urbanization that's going to be going on in the next 50 years. This is a huge impact one way or another, depending on how we choose to do it. And part of my research was to look at ways to model that and to develop new kinds of choices. And this is a tool that I developed with Ward Cunningham using Christopher Alexander's pattern language approach to be able to model design choices using patterns and being able to calculate things like greenhouse gas emissions from the, make predictions about the results of different design choices. I think we need to do that. We need to find ways to measure and predict the externalities, bring those externalities into the transactions, let good projects be rewarded for their lower impacts, and not so good projects pay their true cost of their impacts. So on the just little time left, I want to spend some time talking background a little bit about urbanization and what the pattern is. The city is something that, this is why we build cities at all. We have a place that we can come together to create a life together, a livelihood, an economic life, a culture, a polis. But in doing so, we potentially constrain each other's freedom to participate in that life and by the things that we do. So the structures of public and private space really constitute a kind of mediation between those conflicts that itself is a political system, as my friend Paul Moraine has pointed out. And I know that's kind of abstract, so let me just give you a concrete example. If you're partying until 3 a.m., your freedom to do that constrains my freedom to sleep, right? So how are we going to deal with that conflict? One way to do it is to simply segregate. Put your home over here, my home over there, maybe even further apart still. Problem solved, right? Well, that's the formula for sprawl. Another approach is to mediate, to find mitigating urban structures that will allow you to party until 3 a.m. while I sleep soundly. Maybe it's a wall, maybe it's certain kind of windows, or windows are placed differently, or whatever. And then there are also other structures that can connect us in the ways that we want to be connected, and connected to the public realm, to the street, and so on. So this is the system of connections that the city gives us that's fundamentally important to our understanding of what cities really are and how they change over time. They amount to a kind of just mediation, or approaching justice, often not very successfully, between conflicting freedoms. And this is what cities do. Stefano mentioned Basim Hakim and his wonderful work, looking at how these wonderful patterns form over time as a result of people making these very adjustments, responding to codes that describe the just resolution of these kinds of conflicts. And this happens in all of the great cities that we know and love, and gives them their character and their individuality, this adaptive structure. And this kind of self-organization is really rooted in the scale of us as human beings and our experience, our network of places, or what I call place networks. And I'll give you an example of this. I presented this last year too, so apologies for those who have seen this, but I think it's important to understand. This is a street that I used to live on in London, just around the corner. And if you look at it closely, very typical street for London or many, many cities around the world, there are lots of different places where people can be in that environment, and not only be but move, and perhaps see but not move, or hear but not see, through the bushes and so on. And all of these connections are quite complex, and I'm just showing you a few of them here, this kind of web of interconnections of these spaces, or this place network as I call it. And they extend from the most private, the private rooms of a house, the bedrooms and so on, to the more public rooms, the rooms in the front of the house, and then the urban rooms outside of the house, out on the street, the gardens and gateways and other things. And all of these things can be changed by the users to some degree, that affordance that Stefano talked about. I can open or close a door, open or close a window, make adjustments. I can remodel my house. I can make changes over time. And all of that is very important to what happens to my house or my street or my city. And so, in fact, I went back to this same street 5 years later, and it's remarkable. You can see the changes that occurred. Not only people repainted and one of the businesses closed, another one opened, but the articulation of these urban spaces, this place network changed. They built new fences and new hedges, and moved around the entrance some planting that sort of articulates that entrance. The sidewalk seating went away. Maybe it comes back later in the day, I don't know. But it transformed noticeably over that 5 years. And other great cities transform even more over hundreds of years. The example from Venice, the study from Muratori on the left, the original sort of boring cadastral plan that gradually transformed through just these kinds of processes into this fantastic city that we all know and love today. And these actions are responding to the environment and to our needs as human beings for natural characteristics and qualities, the biophilia that Stefano also talked about, that's so very important. And you get that quality in great cities in abundance. You get it not only in the natural vegetation and so on, but in the very architecture. And there's a reason why classical columns evolved the way they did and so on. Very different from what we've done today, this very clean, segregated, rationalized system that we've created. And I think if you look around here in Rome or anywhere else that you go, you'll see these patterns. This is in Pisa, Italy, and I've certainly have been noticing this kind of pattern over and over again, this place network structure. But here's what was built in L'Aquila a couple of years ago, very expensive building, and what you'll notice is the private realm is bang on to the public realm. None of this articulation, and of course it's a very dead space. Here's Oslo a century ago. Actually, the shot is contemporary, but the urbanism is from a century ago. And here's what we're building now in Oslo, a very expensive corporate building with lots of expensive businesses going on in there, people getting into their cars and driving home, and a horrible pedestrian realm, not at all walkable, and none of that articulation that I've been talking about. I think we all recognize, even the leading architects recognize that we're in a profound crisis. And Rem Koolhaas, for example, talks about the fact that the work we do is no longer mutually reinforcing. We're not adding up to something greater. The whole is not greater than the sum of the parts. And yet, if you look at what Rem is doing as a proposal, it's quite cynical. It's like, well, there's nothing we can do, so let's just have a party and make some wild-looking buildings. I think there's a way forward that many people here at this conference have talked about, and Stefano alluded to, the evidence-based approach, recognizing the sustainable power of a human-centered, human-scaled, not only quality of life and livability, but economic livelihood, as Jane Jacobs described. This is the economic engine of cities that makes them great, that is the real wellspring of our wealth. And we need to understand that, particularly as the world is urbanizing and many people live in informal settlements. If we can understand that dynamic and understand how self-organization occurs and can be empowered. This is a remarkable example from Medellin, Colombia, that shows an intervention that the community voted to fund, an escalator that triggered a lot of wonderful sort of catalytic improvements around it. So how can we make that transition? We know what the transition is, but we need to be much more articulate in describing how we're going to get there and understanding the importance in terms of economics and many other characteristics. I don't think there's any lack of appreciation for these kinds of places, but what we need is a clearer understanding of the real power, the mathematical power, the structural power, the fact that these places are rooted in what's known today as fractal mathematics, that they have the characteristics that many modern structures lack. And this is a real poverty in the case of the modern structures. We need to recognize why traditional processes and traditional designs can be so powerful, the collective intelligence that they embody as a kind of evolutionary response to problem solving that is still incredibly valuable to us today, and get over this collective amnesia that we've embraced in the last few years. This city is, of course, this is the Noli plan of Rome, the famous Noli plan, and this city is a great example of how a city transforms over time and becomes richer and more alive and more interconnected in rich ways. And this geometric relationship extends into the mathematical structure of rooms within a building as well as outside of a building, the idea of fractal relationships and spatial networks. And I don't want to glaze your eyes too much about this, but I just want to mention the idea that cities are these interconnected networks of space as well as of other kinds of relationships. And going back to this point I made earlier about the city is not a tree, it's not like the diagram on the left, it's like the diagram on the right. But so much of design today is more like this, where you just, you know, how many houses have you come into where you have the main foyer and there's some kind of dramatic view, and then you go into a room and then there's some kind of dramatic room, and bang, that's it. Instead of what you'll see in lots of traditional buildings, which is a network, a fine-grained network of spaces that look out, look across, look over, and spatially interconnected with each other. This is an example of a house that does that, but you'll see this over and over in Rome, all the interconnected spaces that exist not only in 2 dimensions but in 3 dimensions. This spot, by the way, is not too far from here. Again, that's the power of these connective relationships that I think we need to understand, not only at the level of street design, but at the level of other kinds of relationships. So let me just close on some observations about what kinds of changes we need to make to what I'll call our operating system, the operating system for growth, which is really what guides development these days and rewards people for the economic value of what they're doing. And most people think of growth today as something negative, something to be feared, even if we don't know yet what it is, because often it is so horrible. It's metastatic, as Suzanne said. It's something very much like a cancer. And yet growth can be growth in quality, not just quantity. And that's something that we need to understand. Growth in beauty, in richness, in complexity. And in both cases, there's a stepwise growth that does occur according to rules and processes. They're in biological systems, there are genetic algorithms, there are chemical control systems, forms that compound and differentiate, and so on. And just so in our urban systems, there are also rules and processes, but they're rather cancerous, rather dysfunctional. Segregated use zoning, remote design processes, bank lending rules, traffic engineering, and all the rest. And those are the things that we need to go after. And Jane Jacobs gives us a really rich set of ideas to go after these problems, thinking about cities as a kind of complex adaptive system, more like a garden than a carpentry problem, more like gardening than carpentry. If you think about gardening, it's all about finding and building fertile soils, planting good genetic seeds, watering and fertilizing, pruning and weeding, building trellises and frameworks, and so on. And just so, in urban systems, we need to diagnose and improve existing conditions, not just sweep everything away. Create patterns and prototypes, employ those, find incentives and funding mechanisms, use regulations, build infrastructure and frameworks, and so on. And all of those things combined into strategic toolkits. Coming back to the UN Habitat work, I think this is what we need to be doing there. We need to be thinking about zoning codes and standards, financial mechanisms, ways of rewarding private entities for doing the right thing instead of rewarding them for doing the wrong thing. These hidden subsidies, this $5 trillion oil subsidy, for example, that Dick spoke of, legal legislation, strategic alignments, incentives, and so on and so forth. All of these kinds of things. And ways to share these tools with each other and to find what works, to adapt it to local conditions, to change it if needed, and so on. And Suzanne mentioned the work in Oregon that we're doing. There are some big barriers there, but we've been working to try to get folks thinking about these kinds of issues. I'm not going to go through a lot of the details there, but just to say there are many resources available, and these are not mysterious challenges. There's no reason for us to be thinking about, this is all too confusing, too difficult, we can't make any progress. There's lots of work to be done, lots of opportunities to engage in things like tax policy, for example. Georgia's tax policy is, I think, so important, and many of the other things that these thought leaders have laid out. So I'll close quickly. I'll propose 3 new rules, if you will. One is that a city is not a tree. Let's just agree to that. It is a complex adaptive network. We need to replace the hierarchical models of the SIEM and the Athens Charter with a more dynamic web network approach. The second rule, we need to interface public space with adjacent private spaces at a fine-grained pedestrian scale, which means certain geometries that we need to be using for street spacing, block size, plot size, and frontage, and articulation. And then number 3, we need to think of public spaces and adjacent private ones as affording, as Stefano used that word, affording the capacity of users to make modifications across different scales of time and space, and to self-organize, to participate in the life of the city. And finally, I'll propose 7 diversities of good cities, a diversity of people, background, ages, incomes, and experience, of sizes, distribution, connection of public space, diversity of transportation modes built on the pedestrian as the fundamental mode, diversity of age, type, condition, and aesthetic variety of buildings and landscapes built upon pedestrian scale detail, and ordinary daily beauty, diversity in uses, amenities, and activities across time and space, in size of plot, with small plots as the most common, and finally in diversity in choice for users to make alterations at a range of scales of time and space to increase comfort and well-being and to participate in the life of the city. I think this all amounts to a new agenda for us, an evidence-based agenda with tools that are readily available, and that we do have a way forward. There's no reason for the kind of cynicism and despair that only serves the powerful. We should take the power. Thank you.